what happened in the White House after close to an hour of conversation when President Zelenskyy directly challenged President Trump and Vice President Vance in front of the media and the American people. He really showed his lack of interest in any real good faith negotiations. I can tell you there were a lot of conversations that were happening through different emissaries, both for Zelenskyy and for President Trump, leading up to his visit there to the Oval Office. And President Zelensky's immediate escalation there was frankly quite a surprise. This has created a huge rift in the relationship. President Zelenskyy, as you pointed out in the clips that you played, doesn't believe that he did anything wrong, and that there was no issue with what he brought up in the Oval Office with President Trump. There's going to have to be a rebuilding of any kind of interest in good faith negotiations, I think.
Now that the president and the vice president had their pre-planned argument with President Zelenskyy in public to use it as an excuse to blame him for Trump's decision to represent Putin, MAGA representatives are out to spread that propaganda.
Coming to the Oval Office, with the body language, the shaking of head, the kind of the arms crossed, we found it incredibly disrespectful. We were ready to sign that deal. I want to address directly that this was some type of ambush is absolutely false. We had negotiated the minerals deal in the weeks prior. It was difficult, but it was done and finalized and ready to be signed in the East Room.
So in order to get everything that Trump wants, which is a bunch of rare earth minerals for America, and to apparently cede land to Putin, Zelenskyy was asking for security guarantees since Russia doesn't have a very good track record of following through on keeping the peace. But in order to avoid doing much to get everything that he wants, the plan is to make Zelenskyy the aggressive guy and Putin the guy that just wants to keep the land he stole.
Certainly those are not things that you would say that Russia or Putin celebrates or bestows on his own people.
That's correct. I would not make that claim, and it's clear that that's not the case, nor does President Trump. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about many of these European countries and Zelenskyy himself, who claim to be standing and fighting for the cause of freedom and democracy, when we actually look at what's happening in reality in these countries, as well as with Zelensky's government in Ukraine, is the exact opposite. You have the canceling of elections in Ukraine. You have political parties being silenced or even criminalized or thrown in prison. You have the freedom of religion, churches being shut down. You have political opposition being silenced. You have total government control of the media. We could go down a whole laundry list of issues that are against the values of democracy and freedom. So it really begs the question, as Vice President Vance said again in Munich, it's clear that they're standing against Putin. Obviously, that's clear. But what are they actually really fighting for? And are they aligned with the values that they claim to hold in agreement with us, the values that President Trump and Vice President Vance are standing for? And those are the values of freedom, of peace, and true security.
It's not a mistake for Gabbard to quietly and quickly accept Putin's authoritarianism, then launch into her repeated talking points about Zelenskyy for the sake of muting what she just admitted about Putin. Mainly because one of the main arguments that you'll hear from these representatives of MAGA is that everyone has to appease him in order for him to come to the table, while heaping all the blame on Zelenskyy. It legitimizes and emboldens Putin's actions.
For us, kind of talking about the details and demands of security guarantees before, as President Trump said, look, I don't know that we can get both sides to the table at this point. And, you can't kind of trash the other side going, litigating through the history of this conflict if we're going to bring both sides to the table.
And I truly believe this is Zelenskyy. He has made a precondition of going forward with peace negotiations American security guarantees. And what you saw was him enter into a very public debate with the President of the United States in the Oval Office of, I want, and you heard it, you actually yourself said it to the Secretary of the Treasury, I want an American security guarantee as a precondition for peace negotiations. No president is going to give him as a precondition to peace negotiations. You do the peace negotiations, then you determine what security guarantees, what arrangements.
Back to failed peace negotiations and failed diplomatic agreements brokered by Europe that had no American guarantee that failed. So it's what's different this time. Are you comfortable Would the U.S. diplomatic outreach and the decision to no longer isolate Vladimir Putin, because he has not said anything about making any kind of concession? Volodymyr Zelensky is being asked to do that publicly.
Well, actually, no, he has not. But the Russians showed up.
Congressman Mike Turner there got caught in a couple of those moments where his argument just doesn't hold up under the first follow-up question about it. But they just keep barreling down that road as if their arguments still make sense.
I mean, I'm very comfortable that Marco Rubio, as our Secretary of State, in the lead with these negotiations, is very competent.
Is he in the lead with negotiations, or is it Steve Witkoff?
He is in the lead with the negotiations. I'm very confident of his strength. He has commenced the negotiations. I believe that Zelensky needs to trust him. And he needs to not have this precondition of American security guarantees, which are not coming.
So his advice is that Zelensky just needs to trust this Secretary of State.
What we're arguing here is he has a very large country. They're in full war footing. They're cranking out weapons now at a war footing pace. And we need to figure out, is there a way to get them to stop the war? And the only way you're going to do that is to get Russians engaged in negotiations, something the Europeans haven't been able to do, the Biden administration wasn't able to do or didn't even try. That's the goal here. It's that simple. Can we try to sit with them and figure out whether there's anything, what are the Russians' demands? Under what conditions would the Russians be willing to stop this war? And as I said, we don't know what those are because we haven't talked to them in 3 years. That's the singular goal here, is to try to bring about an end to this conflict, and it begins by getting them to the table. Because if it's not possible, then what we're looking at is a protracted stalemate with thousands of people dying, billions of dollars pouring in, and more death and destruction. And that's not something the president wants to be a part of. He's made it very clear. We don't even know if the peace is possible. And this was understood by the Ukrainians. It was explained to them repeatedly. And that is, here's our strategy. We're trying to get Putin to a negotiating table. Let's not everyone knows the history here, the back and forth. We understand that. We all understand that. But the question now is, can we get them to a table to negotiate?
And apparently the only way to get him to the negotiating table is by refusing to acknowledge he's done anything wrong. In fact, take all that stuff that we can't say about Putin and say it about Zelensky. That's basically what MAGA's approach is to these negotiations. But the fact that the argument that Ukraine shouldn't ask for security guarantees is coming from Marco Rubio is pretty ironic, considering this guy that looks a lot like Marco Rubio once broke down all the reasons why it would be a good idea.
The Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s. Ukraine was left with the world's third largest stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons on the planet. But they signed this agreement with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, that basically said, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we, these three countries that signed to this, will provide for your defense and assure you of your defense. And so Ukraine did that. They gave up these weapons. Well, now, this was signed in 1994, 20 years later, one of the three countries that signed that agreement hasn't just not provided for their defense, they actually invaded them. And I want to make a point on this for a second. Think about if you're one of these other countries around the world right now that feels threatened by your neighbors. And the United States and the rest of the world are going to you and saying, listen, don't develop nuclear weapons. Don't develop nuclear weapons, South Korea. Don't develop nuclear weapons, Japan. Don't develop nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia. We will protect you. We will watch out for you. What kind of lesson do you think this instance sends to them? I think the message this is sending to many nations around the world is perhaps we can no longer count on the security promises made by the free world. Perhaps we need to start looking out for ourselves. And that's why the Ukrainian situation is so much more important than simply what's happening in Europe. This has implications around the world.